Hello everyone! This video is to give you some background in using quotations and quotation marks. Since you're doing inquiry, and inquiry involves interview and primary sources, you're going to have a number of these opportunities to use quotations. So let's dig in. I want to first start with a quick disclaimer though, that there were no actual quotations or facts used in the making of this presentation. Everything in here is not a real life source. Don't go say, my English teacher said that this was true about this subject. I made up all the data and the names and identities and statements. The point was just to talk about punctuation. So, disclaimer said, let's take a look at this. When do we use quotation marks? As we looked at in first semester, we use it for titles of short works. If you remember, long works are going to have italics or underlining, but short works like songs and poems and TV episodes and chapters in a book would have quotation marks. We would also use quotation marks to talk about a word that is ironic, like the affordable French Café Le Central sells entrees for $25 a plate. Well, most people aren't going to consider $25 a plate affordable, so it's ironic, so we put quotation marks around the word that we're discussing. For the purpose of your inquiry, though, the thing you need to be concerned with is that we use quotation marks to quote someone else's exact words. And a good guideline on this could be, for plagiarism purposes, seven or more words in a sequence taken from another source would constitute plagiarism. So be very careful that you're going to avoid exceeding the boundaries there. It is something I find with every paper that we do, that some students end up taking direct sentences from another source, and they may even cite it. But if it's the exact same words show up unbolded in a Google search, then it needs to be in quotation marks. When do we not need quotation marks? And that would be really a paraphrase, which is a restatement of what the text said, a restatement of what your interview subject said. So examples like this. The original is, her life spanned years of incredible change for women. And the paraphrase is, Mary lived through an era of liberating reform for women. Same idea, different words. Or similarly, any trip to Italy should include a visit to Tuscany to sample their exquisite wines. Be sure to include a Tuscan wine tasting experience when visiting Italy. Same idea, different words. And these I actually did take from another source. You're welcome to look at some examples of paraphrasing. So one question that comes up is quotation marks versus citation. What do we need to cite? What do we need to put in quotation marks? And the rule is, for citation, you're going to cite any exact quotation. Again, anything from another source that is identical to another source. You need to show where that quotation came from. You also need to cite any paraphrase from another source. If you took the idea and you put it in your own words, but it's not your idea, it needs to be cited. Similarly, any information that is not yours, anything you didn't know when you started the semester and you started your research, that needs to be cited, because you got that from somewhere. And also anything that's not common world knowledge. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, probably common knowledge. You don't need to cite it. But if you're saying something like 73% of tourists say they would consider coming to Colorado because of our new marijuana laws, that's specific information that needs to be cited. But you only need quotation marks for an exact quotation. Again, you don't need quotation marks for paraphrases. You don't need quotation marks for other information. Just exact quotations. So the question is, how do we punctuate those quotations? We're going to use double quotation marks, and this is an American convention. In Britain, it's common to use single quotation marks, like what you'd have for an apostrophe, but Americans are real smart, and we think that we should use double quotation marks so we don't confuse readers. Generally speaking, they go on the outside of the text quoted, and the punctuation marks, like periods and commas, go inside. So for this example, according to Professor Green, comma, quotation marks, edible food-like substances constitute the majority of the American diet. Few people consume actual food, period, and then the quotation marks. So the whole blue sentence here is the quotation, the exact words. The quotation marks go on either side of it, and the period goes inside. What if you have a question, though? If you're quoting a question, the person who is speaking used a question, and you want to quote that, where do you put the question mark? For example, Political science professor Edward Snow mused, "Why should we trust the government?" So this phrase here, "why should we trust the government," is a question said by this person, Edward Snow. And in that case, because the quotation was a question, we put the question mark inside the quotation marks. Another example, Mark asked him, "Are you going to the new Star Wars movie?" Question. Well, what Mark said, the exact words we're quoting, were originally, that was a question. So the question mark goes inside the quotation marks. Judge Judy asked the defendant, "Don't you think $1,500 is enough?" What Judy said was a question. The question mark goes first, then the quotation marks. On the other hand, when you write the question, you're writing along with your report, and you want to include a question, but you want to quote a sentence from somebody else as part of it, the question mark is yours, so it goes outside the quotation marks. For example, did Bill Gates really say 64K should be enough for anyone? Well, Bill Gates' quote here was not a question. You are the one asking whether he really said it. So the question mark is going to go on the outside. The quotation, which is not a question, is part of your bigger question. Did he really say that? Similarly, you are writing the sentence, "Why are people so reluctant to acknowledge that, quote, the slow cultural drift toward immorality will undermine our nation?" Quotation marks and then a question mark. The question is yours. Why are people reluctant to acknowledge that? The quotation came from someone else, but the quotation was not originally a question. So you're going to put the question mark outside. And in this case, you would also need to have a citation to show who that came from. So let's continue looking at this. When we use quotations, we always want to introduce them. One of my pet peeves when I look at papers, I'm reading along and then all of a sudden there's a quotation and I have no idea who's saying it or what the context is. As a reader, I find that jarring. So you're going to want to have some kind of transitional phrase followed by a comma. That's session 1. And the phrase might be something like, "According to Mr. Jones," or "Dr. Fujiwara of Tokyo University believes." Then, after that, if the quotation is the beginning of a full sentence, you are going to use a capital letter. So, for example, Winston Churchill once stated, comma, quotation mark, capital letter A, "Attitude is a little thing that makes a big difference," period, quotation marks. Winston Churchill's sentence here is a full sentence. We are quoting the whole thing. It's not part of our sentence. We use a capital letter here. Another example, again, I made these up. Betty Bowers, human rights expert and prolific writer, believes, comma, quotation marks, "Vegetarianism is the only morally acceptable alternative," period, quotation marks. Her sentence was originally a full sentence, and we're just introducing it briefly. And because it's a full sentence, we're going to use a capital V, vegetarianism, at the beginning. Now, you may have to for sentence variety, interrupt the sentence. Begin a quotation, then put the acknowledgement, then continue the quotation. So you wouldn't need a capital letter after you've already started it. So for example, quote, "The challenge, comma, quotation mark, says parole officer Michael Foster, comma, quote, is determining whether a previous inmate has a sufficient social support system when he is released from prison, period, quotation mark." So the quotation in blue is all here, interrupted by this crediting phrase. And when you continue the quotation, you do not need to capitalize the is. Don't need to capitalize it because you're just continuing the sentence. It'd be like throwing a random capital letter into your sentence. Another example, "Most organic products," says dietitian Lisa McPherson, "are an unnecessary expense for consumers," period, quotation mark. Again, here's the credit in the middle. The sentence in blue, "Most organic products are an unnecessary expense." You do not need a capital letter when you continue that sentence after interrupting it with the credit. How do we punctuate exact quotations if we're quoting only part of the original sentence? And blending quotations is something you really want to look at so that you get what the original speaker is saying, but still keep you in charge of your paper. For example, I'm supposedly writing about organic products. All of this text is mine. The blue part is a quotation. I want to keep most of it as my writing, so I blend my quotation. Regulation of organic products varies considerably, and many people believe they are simply a waste of money. That's the point I'm trying to make. I want to use support, so I go on to say, organic products are, according to dietitian Linda McPherson, an unnecessary expense for consumers. The part I have quoted here is not by itself a complete sentence. It's okay to do this. I want to keep most of the paper mine, but what I've quoted is not a sentence. Therefore, this first letter does not need to be a capital letter. Well, the way to really get this down is to practice, and I've included in this video some samples and some practice in the session. So go ahead and make that happen. You will also use plenty of quotations in your paper, and you'll get lots of practice there. Ask if you've got other questions. Have a great week.